The morning of November 20th, 1943, 2 o'clock, the black waters off Betio Island held 5,000 United States Marines in silence. They sat packed into flat-bottomed boats, shoulder pressed against shoulder, the diesel fumes mixing with salt spray and the sharp metallic taste of fear that comes before combat. Most had never fired a shot in anger. Most were 19, 20 years old. Some had lied about their age to enlist. In the darkness, they could not see Betio, but they knew it was there. A speck of coral sand barely 2 miles long and 800 yards wide at its broadest point. The intelligence briefings had been clear. 4,500 Japanese defenders, 500 pillboxes and bunkers, 14 coastal defense guns capable of sinking destroyers, interlocking fields of machine gun fire covering every yard of beach, miles of barbed wire strung through the surf, and surrounding it all, like a medieval moat, a coral reef that would tear at the bottom from any vessel foolish enough to approach at the wrong tide. The Japanese commander, Rear Admiral Keiji Shibasaki, had studied the American landings at Guadalcanal 14 months earlier. He had learned from Japanese mistakes. He had calculated the angles, the tide tables, the capacity of American landing craft. He had fortified Betio with 18 months of back-breaking labor, Korean conscripts, hauling coconut logs and concrete, Japanese engineers positioning guns with mathematical precision. When he was finished, he made a statement to his garrison that would be recorded in captured documents. 1,000,000 men cannot take Tarawa in 100 years. He was not boasting. He was calculating. Because Shibasaki had made one assumption that seemed so obvious, so grounded in basic engineering reality, that he never questioned it. He assumed American landing craft would be constrained by the same physical laws that governed Japanese vessels. He assumed they would need deep water to approach the shore. He assumed the reef would stop them. He had never seen a Higgins boat. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. To understand what happened at Tarawa and later at Iwo Jima, Saipan, and 50 other contested beaches across 2 oceans, you must go back a decade earlier. To New Orleans, to a sprawling industrial yard along the Industrial Canal, where a man named Andrew Jackson Higgins built boats for oil prospectors and rum runners. Higgins was not a naval architect. He had no engineering degree from Annapolis or MIT. He was a businessman who understood one thing with absolute clarity. Boats were tools, and tools had to work. By 1938, the United States Navy had spent the better part of 2 decades trying to solve an impossible problem. Since the disastrous Gallipoli campaign of 1915, military planners had understood that modern warfare might require landing armies directly onto hostile beaches. But how? Conventional ships drew too much water. They would ground in the shallows, forcing troops to wade hundreds of yards under fire. The Navy's Bureau of Ships had commissioned studies, built prototypes, tested dozens of designs. Every solution failed the same fundamental test. You could not build a vessel with a shallow enough draft to reach the beach that could also carry a meaningful number of troops and their equipment. The mathematics seemed immutable. A landing craft needed to carry at least 30 men, plus their weapons, ammunition, and supplies. That weight required a certain hull displacement. That displacement required a certain water depth. At low tide, or over reefs, or across the broad, shallow approaches common to Pacific atolls, the physics simply did not work. The best the Navy could produce were variants of the landing craft mechanized steel boxes that drew 4 feet of water when loaded and could barely make 8 knots in calm seas. Andrew Higgins looked at these designs and saw bureaucratic thinking. He saw engineers who had started with theory and tried to force reality to comply. Higgins worked the other way. He started with the swamps and bayous of Louisiana, where oil crews needed to move heavy equipment through water barely deep enough to float a canoe. He had built shallow draft vessels for trappers, who needed to navigate through cypress knees and sandbars. He had built fast boats for rum runners during Prohibition men, who valued speed and shallow draft for obvious reasons. In 1938, Higgins invited Navy observers to watch a demonstration of his Eureka boat, a commercial design he had refined over years of practical use. The Navy men arrived skeptical. They had watched too many promising prototypes fail. But Higgins drove his boat at full throttle directly toward a muddy Louisiana beach. At the last moment, he cut the engine and let momentum carry the vessel onto the sand. A bow ramp dropped. Mock cargo rolled off. The ramp rose. Higgins reversed the engine, and the boat backed cleanly into deep water. The Navy officers checked their watches. 58 seconds from beaching to departure. Higgins ran the demonstration again. And again. The boat never stuck. Never hesitated. The secret was in the hull design, a tunnel stern that protected the propeller and allowed the craft to reverse off obstacles without fouling. The bow ramp was crude but functional, a hinged steel plate that dropped on chains and rose on winches. The Navy placed an initial order for 500 boats. They designated it the LCVP Landing Craft Vehicle Personnel, but everyone who used it called it the Higgins Boat, and the name stuck. By 1942, Higgins Industries occupied 9 city blocks of New Orleans. The factory operated 24 hours a day in 3 shifts. Women welded hulls. Black workers, barred from most defense jobs by segregation, found employment riveting bow ramps and mounting engines. Disabled workers operated drill presses and paint booths. The workforce grew to 20,000. Production climbed to 700 boats per month, then more. Every boat was identical standardized parts, assembly line construction, no customization. Henry Ford had proved that mass production could build automobiles. Higgins proved it could build a navy. The specifications were deceptively simple. Length, 36 feet. Beam, 10 feet, 10 inches. Hull, plywood over a framework of pine, later replaced with steel as production scaled. Engine, a 225 horsepower grey marine diesel. Armament, 2 30-caliber machine guns, 1 mounted port and 1 starboard, operated by the crew. Crew, 3 men, a coxswain at the controls, and 2 sailors to manage the ramp and machine guns. And the critical measurement, the one that would break the Japanese defensive calculations at Tarawa. Draft when fully loaded with 36 combat-equipped Marines, 3 feet 2 inches. The Japanese knew the Americans were building landing craft. Intelligence reports from captured documents and reconnaissance photographs showed the massive production effort. But Japanese naval architects made the same assumption their American counterparts had made before Higgins. Such a vessel could not carry a meaningful combat load and still operate in shallow water. The math did not work. So Japanese defensive planning proceeded on the basis that American landing craft would require at least 4 feet of depth to approach a beach with a full load of troops. At Tarawa, that assumption would prove catastrophic. Betio Island is the largest landmass in Tarawa Atoll, itself a small constellation of coral sand in the Gilbert Islands, roughly 2,400 miles southwest of Pearl Harbor. Before the war, Betio had been a British colonial outpost, a radio station, a few administrative buildings, dense groves of coconut palms. The Japanese captured it in 1941 without resistance. For 2 years, it was a backwater garrison, notable only for its airfield. Then, in early 1943, Japanese Imperial Headquarters designated Tarawa as a critical node in the defensive perimeter meant to shield the home islands from American advance. Engineers arrived with concrete mixers and Korean labor battalions. The transformation of Betio from outpost to fortress consumed 18 months and immense resources. The Japanese built systematically. First came the coastal guns, 8-inch naval rifles salvaged from damaged warships, mounted on reinforced concrete foundations, and positioned to create overlapping fields of fire across the lagoon. These guns could engage American transports at ranges exceeding 15,000 yards. Next came the pillboxes, 500 fortified firing positions constructed from reinforced concrete, coconut logs, and coral sand. Each pillbox was designed to withstand direct hits from naval artillery. The walls were 5 feet thick. The firing slits were narrow and angled to limit enemy sight lines while maximizing defensive coverage. Between the pillboxes, Japanese engineers strung layers of barbed wire, not the simple farm fencing of European trenches, but heavy naval cable fitted with barbed steel plates. They positioned the wire to channel any attacking force into predetermined killing zones. They buried landmines along likely approach routes. They stockpiled ammunition in underground bunkers, millions of rounds for rifles and machine guns, thousands of artillery shells, crates of hand grenades. And they studied the reef. The barrier reef surrounding Betio was a natural fortification more formidable than anything human hands could build. It lay 800 to 1,000 yards offshore, depending on the approach. At high tide, it was submerged under 3 to 4 feet of water, barely enough for conventional landing craft to pass. At low tide, it was exposed, a jagged barrier of coral that would rip open any hull that touched it. Rear Admiral Shibasaki understood that the reef was the keystone of his defense. The Americans would have to time their assault for high tide. They would send their landing craft across the reef during the narrow window, when water depth permitted. But the tide at Tarawa was predictable. It followed a rigid schedule, and Shibasaki knew that after the morning high tide on any given day, the water level would drop steadily throughout the afternoon. The American landing craft would make it to shore during the first wave, perhaps the second. Then the tide would fall, the reef would be exposed. Reinforcements would be trapped on transport ships, unable to cross the barrier. The Marines on the beach would be isolated, cut off from supplies and support, and the 500 pillboxes would systematically destroy them. It was a perfect defensive plan, grounded in careful observation of American doctrine and realistic assessment of material constraints. Shibasaki positioned his best troops, the 7th Sasebo Special Naval Landing Force, elite Japanese Marines trained in amphibious defense in the pillboxes closest to the beach. He ordered fields of fire coordinated so that every yard of sand was covered by at least 3 machine guns. He had his men zero their weapons at low tide, when American infantry would be wading slowly through the shallows. On the evening of November 19, 1943, Shibasaki inspected his defences one final time. American carrier aircraft had been striking Betio for 3 days. Naval gunfire from battleships and cruisers had pounded the island for hours. But the damage was superficial. The coconut palms were shredded. Some surface structures had collapsed. But the pillboxes were intact. The guns were operational. The garrison's morale was high. Shibasaki retired to his command bunker and waited. The Americans would come at dawn. The reef would stop them, and Betio would hold. The first wave launched at 5:45 in the morning. 75 Higgins boats, each loaded with 36 Marines from the 2nd Marine Division, moved toward the line of departure, an imaginary line on the ocean, marked by control vessels, where the landing craft would form up for their final run to shore. Behind them, the big transports sat at anchor, cargo nets hanging down their sides, more Marines waiting to descend into boats for the 2nd and 3rd waves. The bombardment had been extraordinary. 3 battleships, Maryland, Colorado, and Tennessee, had fired hundreds of 16-inch shells at Betio. 5 cruisers and 9 destroyers added their guns. Carrier aircraft dropped bombs and strafed. For 2.5 hours, explosions walked across Betio in a continuous thunder. The Marines in the Higgins boats watched smoke and fire cover the island and allowed themselves to hope the intelligence briefings had been wrong. Maybe there was nothing left alive on Betio. Maybe this would be easy. At 9:10 in the morning, the first Higgins boats crossed the reef. The coxswains felt the hulls scrape coral, heard the grinding sound that meant they were in dangerously shallow water. But the boats kept moving. 3 feet of draft, just enough. They surged forward in a ragged line, diesel engines roaring, spray flying from the bows. The Japanese held their fire until the boats were 500 yards from shore. Then every gun on Betio opened simultaneously. Machine gun tracers, bright red and green in the morning sun, arced out from the pillboxes. Artillery shells burst in the water, sending up columns of spray. The noise was overwhelming, a continuous roar that made thought impossible. The Marines in the boats crouched low, helmets pressed against the sides, gripping their rifles. Bullets punched through the plywood hulls. Men fell without a sound, slumping into the bilges. The coxswains kept their throttles open, kept driving toward shore. There was nowhere else to go. The first boat touched sand at 9:13. The bow ramp dropped. 36 Marines charged out onto Red Beach 1, the landing zone designated on the western end of Betio. They spread out, running across open sand toward the seawall, a 4-foot-high barrier of coconut logs that marked the edge of the beach. Japanese machine guns found them immediately. Men dropped. Others kept running. It was chaos, brutal and immediate. But the boats kept coming. The first wave unloaded and immediately reversed off the beach. The coxswains spun their helms, drove back through the surf, headed for the transports to pick up the second wave. 9 minutes from beach to ship, 9 minutes back. The Japanese defenders had never seen anything like it. Shibasaki's defensive plan depended on the assumption that American landing craft would make one trip to shore, then be stuck on the reef as the tide fell. He had calculated that the Marines would come in discrete waves, separated by hours' time enough for the defenders to reorganize between assaults. Instead, the Higgins boats operated on a loop. They landed troops and immediately returned for more. There was no pause, no respite. By 10 o'clock, the tide began to drop. Shibasaki's moment had arrived. The water level over the reef fell to 18 inches in some places, exposing jagged coral that would destroy any conventional craft. The larger American landing craft, the LCMs designed to carry vehicles, and the tracked LVTs that could climb over the reef, but were too few in number, began to ground out. Some got stuck. Their crews abandoned them, wading through the shallows under fire. But the Higgins boats kept running. 3 feet 2 inches of draft. The coxswains found channels through the coral. They scraped bottom, felt their propellers chew through sand and stone, but the tunnel stern design protected the screws. The boats kept moving. The Japanese had prepared for slow-moving targets, men wading chest-deep through the lagoon, rifles held overhead, struggling against the current. The machine gunners had practiced for exactly this scenario. They had set their guns to sweep the water at a steady, measured pace, creating interlocking bands of fire that would cut down anyone trying to wade ashore. Instead, they faced a continuous stream of boats. The machine gunners adjusted their aim, trying to hit the Higgins boats as they approached. But the boats were fast 9 to 10 knots, even when fully loaded, and they presented moving targets that were difficult to track. Some boats took hits, some caught fire, but most made it through, dropped their ramps, deposited Marines, and reversed away before concentrated fire could destroy them. The mathematics of the assault had shifted. Shibasaki had planned his defense around the assumption that he could destroy American troops faster than they could be, and landed. Every man killed in the water was one less man he would have to fight on the beach. But the Higgins boats changed the equation. They were landing Marines faster than the Japanese could kill them. By noon on November 20th, more than 5,000 Marines were ashore on Betio. They had taken devastating casualties. The beach was a charnel house, bodies floating in the surf, the sand stained dark. But they kept coming, because the boats kept coming. The Japanese defenders fought with suicidal determination. They had been told that Betio was impregnable, that the Americans would break against the reef like waves against stone. When the Marines kept landing, kept advancing, despite horrific losses, the psychological shock was profound. Some Japanese soldiers began to understand that their mathematical certainty, in the belief that the reef would stop, the assault had been wrong. In his command bunker near the center of Betio, Rear Admiral Shibasaki received reports throughout in the morning that contradicted everything his staff had calculated. The Americans were landing in force. The reef was not stopping them. The tide had fallen, yet the boats continued their runs. By early afternoon, Shibasaki grasped the magnitude of his miscalculation. The Americans had solved the landing craft problem. They had boats that could operate in impossibly shallow water while carrying combat loads that should have been physically impossible. He sent a final radio message to Japanese headquarters at Kwajalein. "Our weapons have been destroyed. From now on, everyone is attempting a final charge. May Japan exist for 10,000 years." The message was transmitted at 1:30 in the afternoon on November 21st. Shibasaki died shortly after, killed by American shellfire that collapsed his bunker. The battle for Betio continued for 2 more days. The Japanese fought from pillbox to pillbox, refusing surrender even when their positions became hopeless. The Marines advanced, at yard by yard, using flamethrowers and satchel charges to clear each fortification. The heat was crushing over 90 degrees with suffocating humidity. Men fought in rotting combat fatigues, their boots never dry, their hands blistered from handling weapons in the tropical sun. The Higgins boats never stopped. They brought ammunition when the Marines ran low. They evacuated, wounded, running back to the transport ships where surgeons worked in blood-soaked operating rooms. They brought fresh water, rations, plasma for transfusions. They brought flamethrower fuel and explosives. And they brought more Marines, the reserve battalions that fed into the grinding battle as casualties mounted. By the afternoon of November 23rd, organized Japanese resistance had collapsed. Small groups of defenders fought on, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. Of the 4,500 Japanese who had garrisoned Betio, only 17 survived to be captured. Most had fought until killed. Some committed suicide rather than surrender. A few were too badly wounded to resist when Marines overran their positions. American casualties were staggering: 1,009 Marines and 30 Navy personnel killed, another 2,101 wounded, many of them grievously. The 2nd Marine Division had been mauled. Entire companies had been effectively destroyed in the first hours of fighting. The Marines who survived would carry Tarawa with them for the rest of their lives, the memory of friends killed in the surf, of the smell of death in the tropical heat, of 3 days of continuous combat in conditions that seemed designed to break human endurance. But they had proven something that would reshape the remainder of the Pacific War. You could assault a fortified beach. You could break through coastal defenses designed by competent engineers. You could land an army on a hostile shore against determined opposition. If you had the right boat. The battle for Tarawa sent shockwaves through both American and Japanese strategic planning. For the Americans, it was a brutal education in the realities of amphibious warfare. The initial intelligence had underestimated Japanese defensive capabilities. The pre-invasion bombardment, though massive, had proven insufficient to destroy concrete fortifications. Coordination between naval gunfire and landing forces needed improvement. The Marines needed better equipment for clearing bunkers, more flamethrowers, more demolition charges, better communication between assault teams and support vessels. But the fundamental concept had been validated. The Higgins boat worked. It could deliver troops to a hostile beach faster than defenders could kill them. That mathematical reality, 36 men every 9 minutes per boat, multiplied by dozens or hundreds of boats operating simultaneously, meant that properly executed amphibious assaults could overwhelm even the strongest coastal defenses. The Japanese drew different lessons. After Tarawa, Imperial headquarters understood that barrier reefs would not stop American landing craft. The defensive strategy that had seemed so promising, fortifying beaches and coral atolls, using natural obstacles to slow American assaults, had failed its first major test. Japanese planners began to shift their doctrine. Instead of defending at the waterline, they would defend in depth, using the interior of islands as killing grounds, forcing Americans to fight for every yard of jungle and mountain. This shift would characterize the battles to come: Saipan, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. The Japanese would make the Americans pay in blood for every island, every airfield, every strategic position. But they would never again believe that a coral reef could stop an American landing. Andrew Jackson Higgins, meanwhile, continued to expand production. By 1944, his factories were building not just landing craft, but PT boats, supply vessels, and dozens of other maritime designs. His workforce had grown to 30,000. The Higgins Boat had become the standard for amphibious operations not just in the Pacific, but in Europe as well. On June 6, 1944, D-Day, the largest amphibious invasion in human history, unfolded on the beaches of Normandy. Over 150,000 Allied troops landed on 5 beaches along a 50-mile stretch of the French coast. The first waves came ashore in Higgins boats. Thousands of them, launched from transport ships anchored in the English Channel, each boat carrying its load of 36 infantry across the choppy water to the German-held shore. The Germans had fortified Normandy extensively. They had built the Atlantic Wall, thousands of bunkers, millions of mines, obstacles in the surf designed to rip open landing craft. But they had made the same assumption the Japanese made at Tarawa. They assumed Allied landing craft would need deep water to approach. They positioned their heaviest defences to stop boats grounding in the shallows. The Higgins boats drove through the obstacles. Many were destroyed. The German defences at Normandy were far more sophisticated than anything at Tarawa. But enough boats got through. They landed their troops and returned for more. The loop continued. Ship to shore, shore to ship, over and over, until nearly 2 million men had crossed the Channel in the weeks following D-Day. General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, later said that Andrew Higgins was the man who won the war for us. Not Roosevelt, who provided political leadership. Not Churchill, who rallied British resistance. Not the generals who commanded armies or the admirals who commanded fleets. A boat builder from New Orleans who had solved a problem the world's best naval architects had declared unsolvable. The irony was profound. The Higgins boat was not designed for war. It was designed for commercial use for oil prospectors who needed to navigate Louisiana swamps, for trappers who needed to reach remote bayous, for bootleggers who needed shallow draft and speed to evade Coast Guard cutters. Higgins had taken a civilian design, refined through years of practical use, and adapted it to military requirements. The Navy's engineers, starting from military specifications and theoretical models, had failed to produce anything comparable. This pattern civilian innovation outpacing military engineering repeated throughout the Second World War. The proximity fuse, which revolutionized anti-aircraft fire, was developed by civilian scientists who approached the problem differently than military ordnance experts. The mass production techniques that allowed American industry to outproduce Germany and Japan came from civilian manufacturers who had perfected assembly line methods in peacetime. The cryptanalysts who broke German and Japanese codes were largely civilians recruited for their mathematical skills. The military provided resources, organization, and strategic vision. But many of the specific technical solutions that won battles came from people who had no formal military training, who saw problems from unconventional angles, who were not constrained by doctrinal assumptions about what was possible. Andrew Higgins exemplified this pattern. He had no patience for bureaucracy, no interest in traditional naval architecture. He built boats that worked in the real world in mud and shallow water and rough seas. When the Navy told him his designs violated established principles, he ignored them and kept building. When engineers said something was impossible, he built it anyway and invited them to watch it work. This attitude sometimes created friction with military authorities. Higgins was not diplomatic. He criticized Navy Bureau of Ships openly, calling their designs obsolete and their procurement processes inefficient. He fought with inspectors over specifications. He refused to modify his designs to accommodate what he considered pointless military requirements. His companies were investigated multiple times for alleged contract violations and labor disputes. But the boats kept working. And when Marines needed to storm beaches from Tarawa to Okinawa, when Army infantry needed to cross the Rhine, When Allied forces needed to land in Sicily and Italy and southern France, the Higgins boats were there, over 23,000 of them, built in New Orleans and shipped to every theatre of war. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The human cost of Tarawa remained controversial long after the battle ended. 1,009 Marines dead in 76 hours, the highest casualty rate per unit time of any battle in Marine Corps history to that point. Journalists who witnessed the aftermath sent back reports that shocked the American public. Time magazine correspondent Robert Sherrod, who landed with the Marines, wrote descriptions of carnage that military censors initially refused to clear. Bodies floating in the surf, wrecked landing craft burning on the reef. The sickly sweet smell of death that pervaded Betio for weeks. Military historians debated whether Tarawa had been necessary. The Gilbert Islands had limited strategic value. Betio's airfield could have been neutralized by carrier aircraft without the need for invasion. Some critics argued that Tarawa was a rehearsal, a costly experiment to test amphibious doctrine before the critical battles to come in the Marshalls and Marianas. But the Marines who fought at Tarawa and survived understood something the critics did not. They had learned lessons that would save lives in future battles. They had proven that beach fortifications could be overcome. They had tested equipment under combat conditions and identified what worked and what failed. They had demonstrated that American industrial capacity exemplified by the Higgins boat could deliver overwhelming material superiority even in the most difficult tactical situations. Lieutenant Colonel David Shoup, who commanded the 2nd Marines at Tarawa and later became Commandant of the Marine Corps, defended the battle in testimony before Congress. He pointed out that every subsequent amphibious landing in the Pacific benefited from lessons learned at Betio. The improved tactics, better coordination between naval gunfire and ground forces, enhanced communication equipment, refined doctrine for clearing fortified positions, all of these came directly from Tarawa. The casualties were terrible, but they were not meaningless. The Marines who died on Red Beach brought knowledge with their lives, knowledge that would be applied at Saipan, where casualties were lower than they might have been. At Iwo Jima, where the assault succeeded despite ferocious resistance. At Okinawa, where 82 days of fighting resulted in victory rather than stalemate. For the Japanese, Tarawa marked a turning point in defensive thinking. After Betio fell in 3 days, despite 18 months of fortification, Japanese commanders understood that static defenses at the waterline would not stop American amphibious assaults. The new strategy defense in depth, using terrain to force attritional battles, would exact a terrible price from American forces in the battles to come. But it was an admission that the mathematical certainty of Tarawa's defenses had been an illusion. The reef had not saved them. The fortifications had not saved them. The courage of the defenders had not saved them. They had been overwhelmed by a simple, mass-produced boat that could operate in 3 feet of water and deliver 36 Marines every 9 minutes. Andrew Jackson Higgins died in 1952. His company had collapsed after the war. The contracts that had sustained massive wartime production evaporated with the peace. Higgins Industries declared bankruptcy in 1946. The factory buildings along the industrial canal were sold or demolished. The workforce dispersed to other jobs. By the time Higgins died, his name was largely forgotten by the public. The boats remained. Museums collected them, the Smithsonian, the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, military installations around the world. Veterans who had ridden in Higgins boats to hostile beaches sometimes visited these museums, standing quietly beside the preserved craft, remembering mornings when their lives had depended on plywood hulls and diesel engines and coxswains who drove straight into machine gun fire because there was nowhere else to go. The Higgins boat represented a particular kind of American advantage in the Second World War, not technological sophistication, but practical engineering. Not the most advanced design, but the most producible. Not theoretical elegance, but real-world functionality. Germany built better tanks, better submarines, better jet aircraft. Japan built better torpedoes, better carrier aircraft early in the war. But America built Higgins boats by the tens of thousands, Liberty ships by the hundreds, Sherman tanks by the tens of thousands. Quantity has a quality all its own, Stalin supposedly said. The Higgins boat proved that mass production, standardized design, and practical functionality could overcome sophisticated defenses. The Japanese at Tarawa had prepared for a battle of engineering their concrete and steel and coral against American technology. What they got was a battle of industrial capacity. And industrial capacity, it turned out, could be embodied in a simple plywood boat that drew 3 feet of water. The memorial on Betio today is a modest affair, a concrete marker near Red Beach, where the heaviest fighting occurred. The pillboxes remain, slowly crumbling under tropical weather and vegetation. The reef is still there, unchanged by 70 years of tides. Occasionally, tourists visit military historians, veterans' descendants, travelers curious about battles they have read about. The locals on Tarawa remember the war as a catastrophe that devastated their islands. The fighting destroyed coconut plantations that had sustained the economy. Unexploded ordnance still turns up in the soil. The battle was not their fight, but they lived with its consequences. For the Marines who survived Betio, the memory never faded. They carried it in their bodies in scars, from shrapnel, in hearing damaged by constant explosions, in the weight they lost during 3 days when eating and sleeping became luxuries. They carried it in their minds, the faces of friends killed beside them, the impossible heat, the smell, the sounds of wounded men calling for corpsmen who sometimes never came. But they also carried a strange pride. They had done something that military theorists had said was nearly impossible. They had stormed a fortified beach against elite defenders who had every advantage of terrain and preparation. They had suffered casualties that would have broken lesser units, and they had kept fighting, and they had won. The Higgins boat made victory possible, but the Marines had paid for it in blood. 3 feet 2 inches of draft. That was the margin. 3 feet 2 inches, and the ingenuity of a boat builder who had learned his trade in Louisiana swamps, building vessels for trappers and bootleggers and oil workers who needed shallow draft and reliability above all else. The Japanese at Tarawa had calculated everything except that. They had measured the reef, plotted the tides, positioned their guns with mathematical precision. They had built fortifications that could withstand bombardment. They had trained their troops to the highest standards. They had created interlocking fields of fire that should have made the beaches impassable. But they had assumed American landing craft would follow conventional design parameters. They had assumed the laws of physics and engineering would constrain the assault. They had assumed the reef would be a barrier that no landing force could cross in strength. They never imagined that a civilian boat designer from New Orleans, working without formal training in naval architecture, would solve the problem they assumed was unsolvable. They never imagined that American mass production could deliver thousands of these boats to the Pacific in time to matter. They never imagined that their mathematical certainty, the conviction that Betio could not fall, rested on a single false assumption. War is full of such moments. Battles turn on unexpected factors. Defensive plans collapse because of engineering details. Lives are saved or lost based on the draft depth of a landing craft. The grand strategies of nations come down to questions like, how many men can this boat carry, and how fast can it make the run from ship to shore? At Tarawa, the answer to those questions broke the Japanese defensive line. The Higgins boat, unglamorous and utilitarian, proved more decisive than battleship bombardments or carrier strikes. 36 Marines at a time, every 9 minutes, until the mathematics of attrition shifted in America's favor. The Marines paid the price. 1,009 dead. 2,101 wounded. Bodies floating in the lagoon. Names etched on memorials. Letters sent to families who would never see their sons again. But the battle proved that American amphibious doctrine worked. That island fortress could be taken. The road to Tokyo ran through contested beaches and coral reefs. That victory was possible if you had the right tools and the willingness to use them despite the cost. Andrew Higgins provided the tools. The Marines provided the willingness. Together, they broke the fortress that 1,000,000 men could not take in 100 years. They did it in 76 hours. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.